Hello crafty friend, this is Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm sharing 6 ways to use a cover plate die to create 6 different backgrounds for your cards. I've got everything from simple to all the mixed media you can get. While the main focus of this video is on the backgrounds, I do share a few tips about how I've embellished each card as well. The cover plate die I'll be using to create each card is this Geo Squares cover plate by scrapbook.com. I'll be doing some stamping with VersaFine pigment ink in Onyx Black because I'm using some clear stamps. I prefer this ink because it doesn't stain them quite so bad. The stamp sets I'll be using are Snippets of Nature and Journal Notes by Sam Poole on Creative Expressions. I'll also be using the Etcetera stamp set by Tim Holtz and Stampers Anonymous. I'll be doing some ink blending with Walnut Stain Distress ink. I'll be using Distress Oxide sprays in Antique Linen, Speckled Egg, Rusty Hinge, and Bundled Sage. I'll be using Sizzix Luster Wax in Charcoal and Gold. I'll be using the new Distress Mica Stain in Unraveled. I'll also be using Distress Texture Paste with a palette knife and some collage medium. I'll also be using a sanding disc and a distress sprayer. And you will need 2 pieces of distress watercolor paper cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches, 1 piece cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, and a piece of white heavyweight cardstock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. All of the colors and elements I chose to work with were inspired by this cozy pattern paper pad from scrapbook.com. It contains a combination of patterns and solids in great fall colors, but I really like the Botanical Nature color palette that was used. I also used the boho paper pad as well. And both of these paper pads come in A2 and 6x8 size. And what's nice with the patterns is that they are the same scale in both paper pad sizes. To embellish each card, I used the scrapbook.com Cozy Autumn Foliage die set, Delicate Leaves die set, Patterned Butterflies die set, and DIY Pockets die set. And these were die cut from the Cozy and Boho paper pads. I'll also be using a Ranger sanding disc and some Walnut Stain Distress ink. I used Spellbinder's Sign Here stamp set and the Tim Holtz Ticket Booth, Correspondence, and Field Note stamp sets to create some ephemera. And for the sentiments, I used the scrapbook.com Friendly Bouquets stamp set. If you're interested in the exact products I've used, you can find links to them in the description box below. When you shop through those links, it supports me, and I really do appreciate that so very much. This first background is rather simple and just the basic way to use a cover plate die. I'm going to cut it from a piece of colored cardstock. Because the die and the paper are the same size, I'm going to use a piece of mint tape to help hold the paper in place as I run it through my die cutting machine. Off camera, I ran it through my die cutting machine and here is the die cut. To take this to the next level though, I'm going to do some sanding using a sanding disc, but you can use a piece of fine grit sandpaper as well. This paper that I'm using has a white core and the color is printed on it. So when you sand it, the color is removed and you can see the white core. I love the distressed feel this adds to the paper. While I'm sanding the paper, I like to work on a piece of scrap packaging so I don't ruin my craft mat or work surface. I then just rub the sandpaper over the paper to reveal the white core of the paper. To adhere the die cuts to the pattern paper, I'm using scrapbook.com Artiste glue. The fine tip on this is perfect for applying adhesive to delicate die cuts. If you happen to not get it lined up just perfectly, you can use scissors or a paper trimmer to cut off the excess. To embellish this card, I die cut a couple of rectangles from the same colors and patterns of paper. I sanded the edges of the dark blue paper and inked the edges of the pattern paper with Walnut Stain Distress ink. I then added a piece of ephemera I made using a stamp from the Spellbinder's Sign Here stamp set. I created a cluster with die cuts using some of the solid color papers from the Cozy and Boho paper pads. The die sets I used are the scrapbook.com Cozy Autumn Foliage and Delicate Leaves die sets. On top of the cluster, I added another ephemera piece created using the Tim Holtz Correspondence stamp set. And here's what the finished card looks like. For the embellishments on each of these cards, I'm going to be using a similar cluster of die cuts, so I wanted to share a little bit about that with you. As I mentioned, I used the Scrapbook.com Cozy Autumn Foliage and Delicate Leaves die sets, and I cut them out of some of the solid colored papers from the Cozy and Boho paper pads. To add some interest and distress to the die cuts, I'm going to sand them. I've shared about how to do this with the delicate die cuts in a previous video, but I'm sharing it again here just in case you missed it. I keep one of the papers I die cut the shapes from, and I place that on top of a packaging insert just to protect my work surface. I place the die cuts back into the paper and then rub over it with a piece of sandpaper. Here I'm using a Ranger sanding disc. I make sure to gently hold the die cut as I rub away from my fingers, following the shape of the die cut. I keep moving where I'm holding the die cut as I sand each new section. All of these tricks help minimize the chance of tearing the die cut. I then repeat this process for each of the other die cuts. This technique works great with white core printed papers like the ones I'm working with here. Another option would be the Tim Holtz craft stock, which has a craft core and the color printed on one side. Next, I'm going to share a little trick for arranging and adhering clusters of die cuts. I begin by taking the die cuts and arranging them until I'm happy with how they are laid out. I personally have always struggled with getting the dies laid out like I want them, and then when I go to adhere them, I end up messing up the layout and have to start all over. Well, this little trick has helped solve that issue for me. Once I get the die cuts arranged how I want them, I hold them firmly with my left hand and grab them with a pair of reverse grip tweezers. I then pick them up and flip them over and then apply the adhesive. I don't have to worry about them moving around, and everything stays right where I want it thanks to the tweezers. I continue applying small dots of adhesive until everything is stuck together. And there you have it, an easy way to adhere die cuts to create a cluster. For this second background technique, I'm going to use the cover plate to emboss a piece of colored cardstock. I'm going to show you how to do it using a Sizzix Big Shot, but if you have a different die cutting machine, please check with the manufacturer for the proper sandwich to achieve these results. With the Big Shot, you'll need the standard platform. Make sure to remove the thin die adapter plate, and then place a standard cutting pad on top of the platform. Next, place a silicone rubber pad on top of the cutting pad. Here I'm taking a piece of colored cardstock and adhering it to the cover plate die as I did earlier using a piece of mint tape. I then place this so that the die is facing down into the paper and the silicone rubber pad. I then place another cutting pad on top. Here I'm using a magic mat, and then I run it through my die cutting machine. And here's what it looks like. The paper is embossed with the design from the cover plate instead of being cut. This paper is a little thinner, so it tends to crack when it's embossed, which is the white cracks you see here and there. I personally like the texture this adds to it. So now I'm going to take that embossed paper and add some interest to it using gold Sizzix luster wax. I dip my finger into the jar to pick up some of the wax. I then smear it around in the lid to help even out how much is on my finger, and then lightly rub my finger over the raised surface of the embossed paper. The wax highlights the embossed design and really makes for a stunning background. After I finish applying the wax, I'm going to set the paper to the side and give the wax time to dry. Once it's dry, it's permanent, but while it's drying, it can rub off, so just keep that in mind. After the wax had dried, I embellished this card with another cluster of die cuts using the Scrapbook.com Cozy Autumn Foliage and Delicate Leaves die sets. I also cut a couple of butterfly die cuts using the Scrapbook.com Pattern Butterflies die set. Here's a look at the completed card. For background number 3, I'm going to emboss a piece of distressed watercolor paper using the same method I used for the second background. Once again, I'll be using a piece of mint tape to hold the paper in place on the die as I run it through my die cutting machine. As you can see, the paper is once again embossed with the design from the die. Now I'm placing the paper into my splat box to do some ink spraying with Distress Mica Stain in Unraveled. The splat box is just a way to keep the ink from getting all over my desk and work area. Before you spray with the mica stains, you just need to make sure that you shake them well until the mica is fully mixed in with the liquid. Once it's well mixed, I spray the paper with the mica stain. I then wipe the sprayer off onto the paper towel to keep the product from drying and clogging the sprayer. I spritz the paper with water using my distress sprayer to help the ink move around a bit more, and then use my heat tool to dry the ink. Look at that gorgeous shimmer from the mica stain. It's even better in real life. Once the ink is dry, I'm going to add some more interest by applying Sizzix Luster Wax in charcoal. I'm using the same technique to apply it as before. And I don't want to completely cover the sprayed background I just created, so I'm only rubbing it here and there over the surface. I love the addition of the shimmer from the luster wax, and it's a great way to bring out the embossed design even more. For the embellishment on this card, I added a bingo card cut from a piece of patterned paper. I then added a cluster of the greenery die cuts, along with some pieces of ephemera I made using stamps from the Tim Holtz ticket booth and Correspondence stamp sets. Here's a look at the finished card. The next 3 techniques all involve using the cover plate die as a stencil. I'm taking a piece of white heavyweight cardstock and die cutting it, and then I will use this to create a reusable paper stencil. You may have tried this before by cutting a piece of paper and then using that as your stencil. But if you want to use it with any medium such as a paste or sprays, you'll be lucky to get 1 or 2 uses out of it before it just won't hold up anymore. Well, I came up with a way to prolong the life of the paper stencil. Once you have the paper die cut, you are going to use a brush to apply Distress Collage Medium to it. Distress Collage Medium will protect the paper and allow you to reuse this paper stencil multiple times. After I apply a coat to one side of the die cut, I lift it off my craft mat and set it to the side to dry. I then clean off my craft mat and clean my brush. And don't be like me and not clean Distress Collage Medium off your brush. Let's just say it's not the most fun thing you've ever done to try to get this off of a brush once it's dry. Once the collage medium has dried, I'm going to repeat the process of applying it to the other side of the paper and set it to the side to dry. Once it's completely dry, your reusable stencil is ready to go. Now it's time for the 4th background, and for this one, I'm going to start by doing stamping on a piece of distressed watercolor paper cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. I'm going to be working on my stamping platform, but you could also use a stamping block. The stamp sets I'm using are Snippets of Nature by Sam Poole and Creative Expressions, and Etcetera by Tim Holtz and Stampers Anonymous. I'm stamping the images using Onyx Black VersaFine pigment ink. I like to use this ink when I'm working with clear stamps because it doesn't stain them as bad as Distress Archival ink, which is what I normally use with my rubber stamps. As I'm stamping, I use various images to create a collage of sorts on the background paper. Once I'm finished with the stamping, I'm going to take the reusable stencil I created with the cover plate die and place it over the stamped background. I then use a palette knife to apply Distress Texture Paste through the stencil. After I've applied the paste, I gently peel up the stencil and set the background paper to the side to dry. I then use my palette knife to scrape off the excess paste from the stencil. You can also use a damp paper towel to wipe some of the excess off as well, and you'll see me do this later on in the video. After the paste has had time to dry, I'm going to place this background paper in my splat box. Next, I'm going to add some color using Distress Oxide sprays in Antique Linen, Speckled Egg, Rusty Hinge, and Bundled Sage. Remember to shake them until the pigment is well mixed before you begin spraying. One thing about sprays though is you never know just how they're going to come out of the bottle. Sometimes more comes out than you want, which is what happened here with Rusty Hinge. Thankfully, because oxide inks are pigment-based, you can actually layer colors and cover up the color underneath, which is what I'm doing here. I then use my heat tool to dry the ink. Next, I'm going to add some shimmer by spraying the paper with unraveled Distress Mica Stain. As I mentioned earlier, just make sure you have shaken it well and have the mica mixed in before you begin spraying. I then use my heat tool to dry the ink. I then remove the nozzle and add a few splatters for a little more texture. And after the fact, I kind of wish I had just done the splatters instead of spraying the entire paper, but oh well. In the end, the background has loads of texture and interest from the layers of stamping, texture paste, and sprays. I felt like the card needed a bit of distressing, so here I'm inking the edges with walnut stained distress ink. Next, I use my distress sprayer to add some water droplets by squeezing the trigger slowly. This reactivates the ink where the water comes in contact with it. I then dab at the water droplets with a paper towel to lift off some of the ink, and then dry the paper using my heat tool. To complete this card, I matted it with a piece of patterned paper from the Cozy Paper Pad. As you can see, I die cut some of the greenery from the center of this piece of paper, which allows me to use the paper to mat the background since it will cover up where they were cut out. This is a great way to get the most out of your patterned papers, since it would have been covering up that area anyway. I finished this card off by adhering another embellishment cluster I created using the greenery die cuts, some pieces of ephemera made using stamps from the Tim Holtz ticket booth and field notes stamp set, and a butterfly die cut. Here's a look at the completed card. Now on to background number 5. For this one, I'm going to do some stamping with the Journal Notes stamp set by Sampool and Creative Expressions. But instead of stamping the full image onto the paper, I'm just going to stamp parts of it here and there around the paper to create my own custom background design. Once again, I'm using VersaFine pigment ink to stamp the images. I then remove the stamp from the stamping platform so that I have a little more control, and I stamp small sections of the image to fill in some of the open areas. Now I'm going to take the background and place it in my splat box, and I'm going to add some color using Distress Oxide sprays with the reusable stencil. I'm using the same colors as before: Antique Linen, Speckled Egg, Rusty Hinge, and Bundled Sage. And once again, the Rusty Hinge is taking over, so I add some more of the other colors to help tone it down. I then remove the stencil and use my heat tool to dry the ink. I then take my Distress sprayer and pull slowly on the trigger to create larger droplets of water over the paper. I dry it a bit with my heat tool and then dab the rest of the wet ink up with a paper towel. To finish off the background, I ink the edges with walnut stain distress ink. I then spritz the paper with water, dab off some of the ink with a paper towel, and then dry it with my heat tool. To complete this card, I layered it onto a piece of patterned paper from the Cozy Paper Pad, and I inked the edges with walnut stain distress ink. As you can see, I die cut some of the greenery from the center of this piece as well. I then adhered a cluster I created by tucking the greenery die cuts into a little pocket I created. Next, I added some stamped ephemera I made using the Tim Holtz Correspondence and Field Notes stamp sets, and finished it off with a die cut butterfly. And here's what this card looks like when it's finished. Last but not least is background number 6. Before I use the stencil again though, I'm going to clean it off by wiping over it with a damp paper towel to remove some of the ink from the oxide sprays. This was done right after I had used it with the spray inks and before the ink had time to dry. As you can see, it cleans up pretty well. I then let the stencil dry before using it again. Now that the stencil is dry, I'm ready for the next use of it. Before I begin though, I'm going to use some temporary adhesive to help hold the piece of distressed watercolor paper cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches in place. I then position the stencil over the paper and begin applying Distress Oxide inks in Antique Linen, Speckled Egg, and Bundled Sage using blending brushes. I apply the ink across the panel, adding colors and blending them until the paper is covered. I lift up the stencil to reveal the design and then wipe it off again using a damp paper towel. Next, I take my distress sprayer and pull the trigger slowly to create larger water droplets. This activates the ink and causes it to flow. I then use my heat tool to dry the water droplets. Even after using this stencil 3 times, it's still going strong and gave me a nice stenciled image. While it might not be as crisp as a regular stencil, or if you just use a die cut without adding the collage medium, I like the little bit of irregularity created from the collage medium and how it adds a touch of distress and interest to the stencil design. Either way, I love the idea that I can use this one die cut over and over again as a stencil. To finish off this card, I added another cluster of the greenery die cuts layered on top of some stamped ephemera I created using Tim Holtz ticket booth and Field Notes stamp set. Here's a look at the completed card. I hope you enjoyed learning 6 ways to use a cover plate die to create backgrounds for your cards. As always, if you want to see more images of these cards, you can find the link to my blog post in the description box below. Until next time, stay crafty. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.